What if the school meant to nurture your child's dreams was secretly crushing their spirit? Meet Rachel Dorson, a brilliant student whose love for learning turned to dread under the watch of a teacher who singled her out. When her father, a civil rights attorney, uncovers the shocking truth, he faces a choice: stay silent or wage war against an institution hiding dark secrets. This is the gripping story of a father's fight to reclaim his daughter's voice, and the explosive battle that exposes how silence can be the deadliest weapon of all. In the prestigious halls of Somerton High School, where academic excellence was worn like a badge of honor and college acceptance letters decorated guidance counselor offices like trophies, something sinister was unfolding. The marble floors gleamed under fluorescent lights, and the walls showcased decades of achievement: honor roll students, state championship teams, and distinguished alumni who had gone on to change the world. But for one student, these very halls had become a prison. Rachel Dorson had always been different from her peers, but not in the way you might think. While other 15-year-olds struggled with algebra or fumbled through Shakespeare, Rachel excelled effortlessly. Her essays earned praise from English teachers, her science projects won regional competitions, and her participation in class discussions often left even veteran educators impressed. She was the kind of student every teacher claimed to love having in their classroom. Until this year. Until Mr. Fletcher. The change in Rachel didn't happen overnight. Like most insidious forms of cruelty, it crept in slowly, disguised as discipline, masked as high standards, and justified through twisted logic that would make any reasonable person sick to their stomach. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand the magnitude of what happened next, you need to understand the family at the center of this storm. John Dorson was the kind of father every child deserves. A successful attorney who had built his career on fighting for the underdog. He believed deeply in justice, fairness, and the power of speaking truth to power. His law office downtown was filled with thank you letters from families he'd helped, settlements that had changed lives, and testimonies from those who had nowhere else to turn. But all of his professional success paled in comparison to his pride in being Rachel's father. John had met his wife Marie during their college years, and their love story was the kind that made their friends believe in soulmates. Marie, a nurse at the local hospital, shared John's passion for helping others, though she channeled it through healing rather than litigation. Together, they had created a home filled with laughter, learning, and unconditional love. Rachel wasn't just their daughter. She was the center of their universe, the bright star around which their entire world revolved. The first signs that something was wrong came on a Tuesday in September. John still remembers the date because it was the same day he'd won a particularly challenging case, and he'd been eager to share the good news with his family. He'd left work early, stopping by Rachel's favorite bakery to pick up celebratory cupcakes, humming to himself as he imagined her excitement when he told her about his victory. But when Rachel came home that afternoon, there were no smiles, no excited questions about his day, no interest in the cupcakes that sat untouched on the kitchen counter. Instead, she moved through their house like a ghost, her usual vibrant energy replaced by something that made John's chest tighten with worry. "How was school today, sweetheart?" he asked, watching carefully as Rachel's shoulders tensed at the question. "Fine," came the reply, so quick and hollow that it might as well have been a lie written in neon letters. John exchanged a glance with Marie, who was standing in the kitchen doorway, dish towel forgotten in her hands. In 15 years of being Rachel's parents, they had never heard her describe anything as simply fine. Rachel was a storyteller, a young woman who could turn a trip to the grocery store into an adventure worth sharing. She was passionate about everything: her classes, her friends, her dreams of becoming a civil rights lawyer like her father. Fine wasn't in her vocabulary, but that Tuesday afternoon, fine was all they got. And as the days turned into weeks, fine became Rachel's default response to everything. How was the math test? Fine. Did you enjoy lunch with your friends? Fine. Are you excited about the upcoming school festival? Fine. John found himself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling and trying to piece together a puzzle with missing pieces. Rachel's grades hadn't dropped, if anything. She seemed to be working harder than ever, staying up late with her homework, spending hours on projects that should have taken minutes. But the joy was gone. The spark that had always defined their daughter had dimmed to barely a flicker. Marie, with her nurse's intuition for detecting pain that others couldn't see, was the first to voice what they were both thinking. "Something's happening at school," she said one evening as they sat in their bedroom, voices low to avoid being overheard. "This isn't teenage mood swings or friend drama. This is something else." John nodded, his lawyer's mind already working through possibilities. Bullying was the obvious concern, but Rachel had never been a target before. She was well-liked, confident, and had a solid group of friends who had been part of her life since elementary school. Academic pressure seemed unlikely too. Rachel had always been a straight-A student who managed her workload with ease. "Maybe we should talk to her teachers," John suggested, but even as he said it, something felt off. Rachel had always loved school, had always spoken enthusiastically about her classes and instructors. This year, she barely mentioned them at all. What John and Marie didn't know was that their daughter was fighting a battle they couldn't see, against an enemy they couldn't imagine. Every morning, Rachel woke up with a knot in her stomach, knowing she would have to face another day in Mr. Fletcher's classroom. Every afternoon, she came home carrying the weight of small cruelties and calculated humiliations that were slowly eroding her sense of self-worth. The comments had started subtly. "Rachel, perhaps you could speak more clearly for the class?" When her diction was already perfect. "I hope everyone else is keeping up with Rachel's unique perspective on this historical event." When she offered an insight that was both accurate and thoughtful. "Let's make sure we're considering all viewpoints, not just the obvious ones." When she answered a question correctly, to an outside observer, these might have seemed like a teacher's attempts to encourage participation or promote diverse thinking, but Rachel could hear the underlying message in Mr. Fletcher's tone, could see it in the way his eyes lingered on her with something that felt like disdain. She was being singled out, targeted, made to feel like her presence in the classroom was somehow problematic. The other students noticed too. At first, some of them tried to include Rachel more deliberately in group discussions, sensing that something was off. But as Mr. Fletcher's behavior became more pronounced, more obviously targeted, an uncomfortable silence settled over the classroom whenever Rachel spoke. Her classmates, faced with the choice between standing up for their friend and avoiding their teacher's attention, chose self-preservation. Rachel found herself withdrawing, participating less in class discussions, avoiding eye contact with Mr. Fletcher, trying to become invisible. But invisibility, she learned, was not an option. The less she participated, the more Mr. Fletcher called on her, his questions designed to put her on the spot, to make her feel uncomfortable and out of place. "Rachel," he would say, his voice carrying across the classroom like a challenge, "surely you have thoughts on this topic. I'm sure your perspective would be valuable to the discussion." The way he said the word perspective always felt loaded, as if her viewpoint was somehow foreign or less valid than her classmates. And slowly, insidiously, Rachel began to believe it. At home, John's concern was growing into something closer to panic. He'd never been the kind of parent to hover or intrude, but he found himself studying Rachel's face when she thought he wasn't looking, searching for clues about what was troubling her. The dark circles under her eyes suggested sleepless nights. The way she pushed food around her plate at dinner indicated a loss of appetite that had nothing to do with teenage vanity. Most concerning of all was the way she seemed to shrink into herself, as if she was trying to take up as little space as possible in the world. "We need to do something," John told Marie one evening after Rachel had excused herself from dinner early, claiming she had homework to finish. "This has been going on for weeks, and it's getting worse." Marie nodded, her own worry evident in the lines creasing her forehead. "I think we should try talking to her one more time." Really talking, not just asking how her day was. But when they knocked on Rachel's bedroom door that night, they were met with a muffled "I'm fine, just tired" that sounded anything but fine. Through the door, they could hear quiet sniffling that made both their hearts break. "Rachel, "Honey, can we come in?" Marie asked gently. "We're worried about you." "There's nothing to worry about," came the response, but the words were thick with tears that Rachel was clearly trying to hide. John's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Every instinct he had as a father was screaming that something was terribly wrong, but he felt powerless to help his own child. It was a feeling that went against everything he stood for, everything he believed about protecting the people he loved. That night, as he lay in bed listening to the sound of Rachel crying quietly in her room down the hall, John made a decision. He was going to get to the bottom of this, whatever it took. His daughter was suffering, and he would not stand by and let it continue. But John had no way of knowing that the truth, when it finally came out, would be worse than anything he had imagined. He had no way of knowing that the person meant to educate and inspire his daughter was the very one systematically trying to break her spirit. And he had no way of knowing that the battle ahead would test not only his skills as a lawyer, but his strength as a father and his faith in the very institutions he'd spent his career defending. The storm was coming, and none of them were prepared for its fury. The morning that would change everything started like any other. Rachel came downstairs for breakfast, her movements mechanical and her eyes focused on the floor. She sat at the kitchen table, picking at the eggs Marie had prepared, while John read through case files and tried to pretend he wasn't watching his daughter's every move. "Do you need a ride to school today?" John asked, hoping to create an opening for conversation. Rachel shook her head without looking up. "I'll walk." It was a 20-minute walk to Somerton High, a journey Rachel had made hundreds of times before. But lately, John noticed, she seemed to dread it more each day. This morning, as she gathered her backpack and headed for the door, her steps were so slow and reluctant that John's heart ached watching her. "Rachel," he called out just before she reached the door. She turned, and for a split second, he saw something in her eyes that looked like desperation, like a plea for help that she couldn't quite voice. "Have a good day, sweetheart. I love you." "Love you too, Dad," she whispered, and then she was gone, leaving John with the unsettling feeling that he just missed something crucial. At work, John found it impossible to concentrate. He sat through a client meeting, conducted a deposition, and reviewed contracts, but his mind kept drifting back to that look in Rachel's eyes. There was something she wanted to tell him, something she needed help with, but she was holding it inside like a secret too terrible to share. By noon, John's anxiety had reached a breaking point. He called the school office, claiming he needed to speak with Rachel about a family matter, but was told she was in class and couldn't be disturbed. He tried calling her cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Every rational thought told him he was overreacting, that Rachel was probably just going through typical teenage struggles, but his paternal instincts were screaming that something was desperately wrong. At 2:30 in the afternoon, John's phone rang. Rachel's name appeared on the caller ID, and his heart immediately started racing. Students weren't supposed to use their phones during school hours, which meant something had happened. "Rachel?" he answered, already grabbing his car keys from his desk. The sound that came through the phone made his blood run cold. Rachel was sobbing, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps that suggested she was on the verge of hyperventilation. "Daddy," she choked out, her voice broken and desperate. "I need you. I'm in the bathroom at school, and I can't go back to class. Please come get me." John was already running toward the elevator, his briefcase and afternoon meetings forgotten. "I'm on my way, sweetheart. Stay exactly where you are. Don't move. Don't go anywhere. I'll be there in 10 minutes. The drive to Somerton High was a blur of running red lights and desperate prayers. John's mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Had someone hurt her? Was she sick? Had there been an accident? The sound of her sobbing echoed in his ears, and he pressed harder on the accelerator, knowing that every second felt like an eternity to his frightened daughter. When he screeched into the school parking lot, John didn't even bother to lock his car. He ran through the front doors, past the startled receptionist, and down the hallway toward the girls' restroom where he knew Rachel was waiting. The thought of propriety or protocol never crossed his mind. His child needed him, and nothing else mattered. "Rachel?" he called out as he pushed open the restroom door. "Rachel, I'm here." The sobbing grew louder, coming from the last stall. John approached slowly, his heart breaking at the sound of his daughter's distress. "It's Dad, sweetheart. Can you open the door?" The lock clicked, and the stall door swung open to reveal Rachel huddled on the floor, her knees drawn up to her chest, her face streaked with tears. Her school uniform was wrinkled, her usually neat braids disheveled, and her eyes held a look of such profound pain that John felt his own eyes fill with tears. Without hesitation, he knelt down on the cold tile floor and gathered her into his arms, holding her as tightly as he could while she continued to sob against his chest. For several minutes, they stayed like that, John whispering reassurances while Rachel cried out weeks of accumulated pain and frustration. "It's okay," he murmured, stroking her hair. "Whatever happened, we'll fix it. You're safe now. I've got you." Gradually, Rachel's sobs began to subside, though her body continued to shake in his arms. John could feel her trying to gather the courage to speak, could sense the weight of whatever she'd been carrying alone for so long. "Dad," she whispered finally, her voice hoarse from crying. "There's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you weeks ago." John pulled back slightly so he could look at her face, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "You can tell me anything, Rachel. Anything at all." Rachel took a shuddering breath, her eyes meeting his for the first time in what felt like months. "It's Mr. Fletcher," she said, and John felt a chill run down his spine. "My history teacher. He's been saying things, doing things, making me feel like I don't belong here." The words came out slowly at first, then faster, as if a dam had burst inside her. Rachel told him about the subtle comments, the way Mr. Fletcher singled her out in class, the looks and gestures that made her feel small and unwelcome. She described how her classmates had started to notice, how some had begun to treat her differently, how the classroom that should have been a place of learning had become a source of daily humiliation. "Today was the worst," Rachel continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "We were studying the civil rights movement, and Mr. Fletcher kept making comments about how some people need to learn to be grateful for what they have instead of always complaining. He kept looking at me when he said it, and then when I tried to participate in the discussion about segregation. He said." She paused, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. John waited, his jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. He said that some students might have personal biases that prevent them from seeing historical events objectively. He said it right in front of everyone, and they all knew he was talking about me. Then, when I was at the board drawing a diagram about the Montgomery bus boycott, I used white chalk, and he said maybe the white chalk would be helpful for me in other ways too. John felt rage unlike anything he'd ever experienced course through his veins. The casual cruelty of the comment, the calculated humiliation, the abuse of power. It took every ounce of his self-control not to storm out of that bathroom and confront Mr. Fletcher immediately. The whole class laughed. Rachel continued, her voice breaking again. "Some of them looked uncomfortable, but they still laughed. And I couldn't stay there anymore. I ran out and came here, and I've been sitting on this floor for an hour trying to figure out what to do." John pulled her close again, his mind racing with lawyer thoughts and father thoughts and everything in between. This wasn't just bullying, this was systematic discrimination, abuse of authority, and quite possibly criminal behavior. "Rachel," he said, his voice steady despite the fury burning inside him. "First, I want you to know that none of this is your fault. None of it. What Mr. Fletcher has been doing is wrong, morally wrong, ethically wrong, and legally wrong. Second, I want you to know that you're never going back into that classroom, not until this is resolved. And third, I want you to know that we're going to make sure this never happens to you or any other student ever again." Rachel looked up at him, and for the first time in weeks, he saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "What are we going to do?" John helped her to her feet, his arm remaining protectively around her shoulders. "We're going to walk out of this bathroom, and we're going to the principal's office. You're going to tell your story to someone who has the power to do something about it. And then, we're going home, and we're going to figure out how to make sure Mr. Fletcher never has the opportunity to treat another child the way he's treated you." As they walked down the hallway together, John felt the weight of the battle ahead. He knew this was just the beginning, that the fight for justice would be long and difficult. But looking at his daughter, seeing the strength she'd shown in finally speaking up, he also felt something else: pride. Rachel had survived weeks of systematic cruelty and had found the courage to break her silence. Now it was his turn to fight for her. The storm had arrived, and John Dorson was ready for war. Principal Sarah Harris had been the administrator at Somerton High for 12 years, and in that time, she dealt with her share of difficult situations: cheating scandals, substance abuse, fights between students. She thought she'd seen it all, but nothing had prepared her for the conversation she was about to have with John and Rachel Dorson. Her office, usually a place where she met with college recruiters and discussed academic achievements, felt heavy with tension as John and Rachel sat across from her desk. Rachel, still shaken from her breakdown in the bathroom, kept her eyes focused on her hands folded in her lap. John, meanwhile, radiated barely contained fury that made the air in the room feel electrically charged. "Mr. Dorson," Principal Harris began, her voice carefully professional, "I understand there's been some kind of incident today involving Rachel and one of her teachers?" John's jaw tightened. "It's not just today, Principal Harris. According to my daughter, this has been going on for weeks. What we're talking about here isn't a simple classroom disagreement or even a personality conflict. We're talking about systematic racial discrimination and harassment by a faculty member." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Principal Harris had known the Dorson family for years. Rachel had been an exemplary student since her freshman year, and John had a reputation in the community as a fair and measured man. If he was making such serious allegations, she knew she needed to listen carefully. "Rachel," she said gently, turning her attention to the girl who had always been one of her favorite students, "can you tell me what's been happening in Mr. Fletcher's class?" What followed was the most difficult conversation Principal Harris had ever had in her professional career. Rachel, with her father's encouraging presence beside her, recounted weeks of subtle and not-so-subtle discrimination. She described being singled out for criticism that didn't match her performance, being excluded from group activities, and being subjected to comments that made her feel unwelcome and inferior. "At first, I thought maybe I was being too sensitive," Rachel explained, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "Mr. Fletcher never used slurs or anything that was obviously racist, but there was always something in his tone, something in the way he looked at me, that made me feel like I didn't belong in his classroom." Principal Harris found herself taking detailed notes, her professional training kicking in even as her heart went out to the young woman across from her desk. She'd observed Mr. Fletcher's classes during routine evaluations and had never noticed anything inappropriate. But she also knew that discriminatory behavior could be subtle and carefully hidden from administrative oversight. "Can you give me specific examples?" she asked, knowing that any formal action would require detailed documentation. Rachel took a deep breath and began to recount incident after incident. "The time Mr. Fletcher questioned whether her essay on Frederick Douglass might be too emotionally driven to be academically sound. The way he consistently mispronounced her name despite being corrected multiple times. The group project where he assigned her to work alone because her passionate perspective might overshadow her classmates' contributions. And today," Rachel continued, her voice beginning to shake again, "during our lesson on the civil rights movement, he made it clear that he thought I couldn't discuss the topic objectively because of my race. Then he made that comment about the white chalk, and everyone laughed. And I couldn't take it anymore." John watched Principal Harris's expression change as Rachel spoke, seeing the administrator's professional concern transform into something deeper recognition of the serious nature of what was being described. When Rachel finished speaking, The office fell silent except for the ticking of the wall clock and the distant sounds of students in the hallways. "This is extremely serious," Principal Harris said finally, her voice heavy with the weight of what she just heard. "If what you're describing is accurate, it represents a clear violation of our anti-discrimination policies and possibly state and federal civil rights laws." John leaned forward, his lawyer instincts fully engaged. "Principal Harris, I appreciate your concern, but I need to know what concrete steps you're going to take to address the situation. My daughter has been subjected to a hostile educational environment for weeks, and I won't allow it to continue for even one more day." Principal Harris nodded, already formulating her plan of action. "First, I'm going to immediately suspend Mr. Fletcher pending a full investigation. Second, I'm going to interview other students in his classes to determine if this behavior has affected anyone else. Third, I'm going to contact the school district's legal department and our diversity and inclusion officer to ensure we handle this properly. And fourth," John added, his voice leaving no room for negotiation, "you're going to make sure that Rachel is transferred to a different history class immediately. She shouldn't have to face that man for another minute." "Of course," Principal Harris agreed quickly. "We have an excellent teacher, Ms. Carter, who can take Rachel into her advanced placement history class. It might actually be a better academic fit anyway, given Rachel's abilities." As they discussed the logistics of Rachel's class transfer and the timeline for the investigation, John felt some of his anger beginning to transform into something more productive: determination. This wasn't just about Rachel anymore, though she would always be his primary concern. This was about making sure no other student would have to endure what his daughter had been through. "I want to be clear about something," John said as their meeting began to wrap up. "While I appreciate the school's willingness to investigate this matter, I'll also be conducting my own inquiry. If we find that Mr. Fletcher's behavior extends beyond what Rachel has experienced, or if we determine that the school's response is inadequate, we'll be pursuing other options." Principal Harris understood the implied threat. John Dorson wasn't just a concerned parent, he was a skilled attorney who specialized in civil rights cases. If the school's handling of this situation was found lacking, it could result in litigation that would be both expensive and damaging to the district's reputation. "I understand your position, Mr. Dorson," she replied. "I want to assure you that we take these allegations very seriously. Somerton High has always prided itself on being an inclusive environment where all students can thrive, and if we've failed in that mission, we need to address it immediately." As they prepared to leave the office, Rachel looked up at Principal Harris with eyes that held both hope and residual fear. "What happens now?" she asked. "What if other teachers start treating me differently because I complained? What if the other students think I'm a troublemaker?" Principal Harris leaned forward, her expression kind but firm. "Rachel, you've shown incredible courage by speaking up about this situation. What you've described isn't complaining, it's reporting discrimination. And that's not only your right but your responsibility. Any teacher or student who treats you poorly because you stood up for yourself will have to answer to me personally." John felt a surge of gratitude toward the principal, recognizing her genuine commitment to protecting his daughter. "Thank you," he said simply. "Rachel, let's go home. Your mom is going to want to hear about this, and we have some planning to do." As they walked out of the school together, John's arm protectively around Rachel's shoulders, he felt a complex mix of emotions. There was still anger, a deep, burning fury at the man who had tried to diminish his brilliant daughter's sense of self-worth. There was worry about the challenges ahead and the potential impact on Rachel's academic and social experience. But there was also something else: pride in Rachel's strength and a renewed sense of purpose. The battle was just beginning, but John knew they were on the right side of it. And for the first time in weeks, as he looked at his daughter walking beside him with her head held high, he saw glimpses of the confident, vibrant young woman she was meant to be. The truth was out now, and there was no going back. Word traveled fast through the interconnected world of Somerton's educational community. By the time John and Rachel arrived home that afternoon, Marie was already waiting for them. Having received a call from the school nurse who was a colleague at the hospital, The three of them sat in their living room, the same space where weeks of worried conversations had taken place. But now the atmosphere was different. The secret was out. The enemy had been identified, and the fight could finally begin. Marie held Rachel close on the couch while John paced the room, his mind already working through the legal and practical implications of what they were facing. As a civil rights attorney, he'd handled cases involving educational discrimination before, but experiencing it as a parent brought an entirely different level of emotional intensity to the situation. "How long do you think the school's investigation will take?" Marie asked, her nurse's training making her focus on concrete timelines and actionable steps. John paused his pacing, running a hand through his hair in the gesture that both women recognized as a sign of deep concentration. "If they're thorough, at least 2 weeks. They'll need to interview other students, review Mr. Fletcher's teaching materials and grade books, and document everything carefully. But honestly, Marie, I'm not sure we can rely entirely on the school's investigation." Rachel looked up from where she'd been resting against her mother's shoulder. "What do you mean?" "I mean," John said carefully, sitting down across from them, "that while Principal Harris seems genuinely concerned and committed to addressing the situation, the school district has interests beyond just finding the truth. They're concerned about liability, about bad publicity, about maintaining their reputation in the community. Sometimes those concerns can influence how thoroughly they investigate." Marie's expression tightened with understanding. "You think they might try to cover it up?" "Not exactly cover it up," John clarified, "but they might be motivated to find a solution that minimizes their exposure rather than one that ensures justice. They might push for Mr. Fletcher to quietly resign or take early retirement rather than face formal disciplinary action that could become public record." The thought of Mr. Fletcher simply moving on to terrorize students at another school made Rachel's stomach turn. "That's not fair," she said, her voice stronger than it had been all day. "What about other kids who might end up in his classes? What about the students he's already hurt that we don't even know about?" John felt that familiar surge of pride in his daughter's character. Even in the midst of her own trauma, she was thinking about others who might be suffering. "That's exactly why we're not going to leave this entirely in the school's hands," he said. "Tomorrow, I'm going to start my own investigation. I'm going to reach out to other families, other students who have been in Mr. Fletcher's classes. I'm going to request copies of his personnel file, his teaching evaluations, any complaints that might have been filed against him in the past." Over the next several days, John threw himself into the investigation with the same intensity he brought to his most important cases. He started by calling other parents in Rachel's class, introducing himself and asking if their children had mentioned anything unusual about Mr. Fletcher's teaching methods or classroom management. The first few calls were frustrating. Parents were polite but cautious, unwilling to say anything that might seem critical of a teacher without concrete evidence. But on his 4th call, John reached Sandra Martinez, whose daughter Carmen was in Rachel's history class. "Mr. Dorson," Sandra said after John explained the reason for his call, "I'm so glad you reached out. Carmen has been coming home upset from Mr. Fletcher's class for weeks, but when I asked her about it, she said she didn't want to get anyone in trouble." John felt his pulse quicken. "Would it be possible for me to speak with Carmen? I understand this is a sensitive situation, but if other students are experiencing similar treatment, let me talk to her," Sandra replied. "Carmen really likes Rachel, and if she thinks speaking up might help her friend, I believe she'll be willing to share what she's observed." That conversation led to another, and then another. John discovered that Mr. Fletcher's discriminatory behavior wasn't limited to Rachel, though she seemed to have borne the brunt of it. 2 other students of color in the class, Marcus Williams, an African-American sophomore, and Diana Chin, whose parents had immigrated from Taiwan, had also been subjected to subtle but persistent mistreatment. Marcus's parents, Robert and Lisa Williams, met with John at his law office on a Saturday morning. Robert, who managed a local hardware store, and Lisa, who taught elementary school in a neighboring district, had noticed changes in their son's behavior similar to what the Dorsons had observed in Rachel. Marcus used to love history, Lisa explained, her voice tight with worry. He'd come home excited about what he'd learned, asking us questions about different time periods and historical figures. But this year, he barely mentions the class at all. Robert nodded grimly. When we've tried to ask him about it, he just says Mr. Fletcher is different from his other teachers. He won't give us specifics, but there's something in his tone that suggests he's uncomfortable. John took detailed notes as they spoke, his lawyer's mind already beginning to see patterns. When he shared what Rachel had experienced, both parents immediately recognized similar incidents involving their son. Last month, Lisa recalled, Marcus told us about a class discussion on World War II where Mr. Fletcher made some comment about how some students might not understand the sacrifices made by real Americans during the war. Marcus said it felt like the teacher was looking right at him when he said it. The more John investigated, the clearer the pattern became. Mr. Fletcher had been carefully targeting students of color in his classes, using subtle language and behavior that would be difficult to prove but devastating in its cumulative effect. He was skilled at operating just below the radar, never saying anything so obviously discriminatory that it couldn't be explained away, but consistently creating an environment where certain students felt unwelcome and inferior. Diana Chen's parents, when John finally reached them, were initially reluctant to discuss their daughter's experiences. The Chens, both professors at the local college, were concerned about potential retaliation and the impact on Diana's academic record. But when John explained the scope of what he discovered, they agreed to share their story. Diana is usually very confident in her academic abilities, Dr. Ellen Chen explained during a phone conversation, but lately, she's been questioning herself constantly, especially in history class. She'll spend hours working on assignments that should take 30 minutes, convinced that she's not understanding the material correctly. Dr. James Chen added his perspective. We've seen Diana handle challenging coursework before, and she's never reacted this way. When we've tried to help her with her history homework, we've found that her understanding of the material is actually quite sophisticated, but she seems to have lost confidence in her own abilities. As John compiled this information, he realized they were dealing with something far more serious than a single teacher's bias. This was a systematic pattern of discrimination that had been flying under the radar of school administrators, destroying students' confidence and creating a hostile learning environment for some of Somerton High's most vulnerable students. The breakthrough came when John decided to dig deeper into Mr. Fletcher's background. Using his legal resources and professional connections, he requested copies of the teacher's personnel file and any complaints that might have been filed against him during his tenure at the school. What he found made his blood run cold. Mr. Fletcher had been the subject of 2 previous informal complaints over the past 5 years, both involving students of color who had reported feeling uncomfortable in his classroom. In both cases, the complaints had been investigated by the school administration and deemed unsubstantiated, with Mr. Fletcher receiving only verbal counseling about the importance of maintaining an inclusive classroom environment. But John's legal training allowed him to read between the lines of the administrative reports. The pattern was there, it had been there all along. The school had simply chosen not to see it, or had decided that 2 isolated complaints weren't significant enough to warrant serious action. Now there were at least 4 students affected, and John suspected there were more who simply hadn't come forward yet. The question was no longer whether Mr. Fletcher was discriminating against students, the question was how long it had been going on and how many young people had suffered in silence because the system had failed to protect them. That evening, as John sat in his home office surrounded by files and documentation, he felt the weight of what he'd uncovered settling heavily on his shoulders. The evidence was damning not just against Mr. Fletcher, but against a system that had repeatedly failed to protect its most vulnerable students. 2 previous complaints had been brushed aside, dismissed as misunderstandings or personality conflicts, while a predatory teacher had been allowed to continue his pattern of psychological abuse. Marie found him there at nearly midnight, staring at the papers spread across his desk with an expression she recognized from his most difficult cases, the look of a man who had discovered an injustice so profound that it demanded everything he had to give. "What did you find?" she asked quietly, settling into the chair across from his desk. John looked up at his wife, seeing his own exhaustion and determination reflected in her eyes. "It's worse than we thought," he said simply. "This has been going on for years, Marie. There's a paper trail of complaints, of students who tried to speak up, of administrators who chose to look the other way rather than deal with a difficult situation." He handed her the personnel file, watching as she read through the sanitized language of administrative reports that barely concealed the truth beneath. Her face grew pale as she absorbed the implications. "How many children?" she whispered. "At least 6 that I can document," John replied. "But I suspect there are more. Students who never reported anything, who just suffered through his classes and moved on. Students who maybe changed their career aspirations or their sense of self-worth because of what they experienced in that classroom." Marie set down the papers, her hands trembling slightly. "What happens now?" John's expression hardened with resolve. "Now we make sure this stops. Not just for Rachel, not just for the students currently in his classes, but for everyone. We're going to hold the school district accountable for their failures, and we're going to make sure Mr. Fletcher never has the opportunity to harm another child." The next morning brought an unexpected phone call from Principal Harris, her voice carrying a tension that hadn't been there during their previous conversation. "Mr. Dorson," she began, "I wanted to update you on our investigation. We've conducted preliminary interviews with several students in Mr. Fletcher's classes, and while we've found some concerning patterns in his teaching methods, we haven't uncovered evidence of overt discriminatory behavior." John felt his jaw clench. This was exactly what he'd feared, an investigation designed more to protect the institution than to uncover the truth. "Principal Harris," he said carefully, "I hope you'll understand that I find that conclusion difficult to accept, given what my own investigation has revealed." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Your own investigation?" "Yes," John replied, making no effort to hide the steel in his voice. "I've spoken with several families whose children have been affected by Mr. Fletcher's behavior. I've also reviewed his personnel file and discovered a pattern of complaints that appears to have been systematically ignored by the school administration." The silence that followed was telling. Principal Harris was clearly consulting with someone, likely the district's legal counsel, about how to respond to John's revelation. "Mr. Dorson," she said finally, "I think it would be beneficial for all parties involved if we could schedule a meeting to discuss your findings. Would it be possible for you to come in tomorrow morning? I'd like to have our district representative present as well." John recognized the shift in tone immediately. This was no longer a conversation between a concerned parent and a school administrator. This had become a legal matter, with both sides preparing for what could potentially become a protracted battle. "I'll be there," he agreed, "but I want to be clear that I'm not coming to negotiate a quiet resolution. I'm coming to ensure that justice is served and that appropriate measures are taken to prevent this from happening to other students." After hanging up, John immediately called his law partner, David Chin, no relation to Diana's family. Despite the shared surname, David had been John's closest friend since law school and specialized in employment discrimination cases. If this situation escalated to litigation, John would need someone he trusted implicitly to help navigate the complex legal landscape ahead. "John," David said after listening to the full account, "you know I'll support you however I can, but I have to ask, are you sure you want to handle this personally? The emotional stakes are incredibly high when it's your own child involved." John had been wrestling with the same question. Every principle of legal ethics suggested that attorneys shouldn't represent family members in significant cases, that the emotional investment could cloud professional judgment. But looking at Rachel, seeing the gradual return of her confidence as she realized she wasn't alone in this fight, John knew he couldn't step aside. "I need to be the one to do this, David," he said finally. "Rachel needs to see that her father will fight for her. And frankly, I need to know that I did everything possible to protect her." but I'll need you to serve as co-counsel, to provide the objective perspective that I might not be able to maintain." David agreed immediately, understanding both the legal and personal dimensions of what they were facing. Together, they began preparing for what would likely be the most important case of John's career, not because of its legal complexity or potential financial rewards, but because his daughter's sense of justice and self-worth hung in the balance. The meeting at the school district offices the next morning was a study in contrasts. On one side sat Principal Harris, looking uncomfortable and conflicted. Dr. Margaret Stevens, the district superintendent, professional but clearly concerned about potential liability, and Thomas Bradley, the district's attorney, whose presence made it clear that the school was preparing for legal action. On the other side sat John and David, armed with files full of documentation and testimony from affected families. The atmosphere in the room was cordial but tense, with both sides understanding that this conversation would likely determine whether the matter could be resolved internally or would require external intervention. Dr. Stevens opened the meeting with what was clearly a prepared statement. "Mr. Dorson, we want to begin by expressing our sincere concern for Rachel and any distress she may have experienced in Mr. Fletcher's classroom. The district takes all allegations of discriminatory behavior seriously, and we're committed to ensuring that every student feels safe and welcomed in our schools." John listened politely, recognizing the careful language designed to express concern without admitting liability. When she finished, he opened the folder in front of him and began laying out the evidence he'd collected. "Dr. Stevens," he began, "I appreciate your expression of concern, but what we're dealing with here isn't a single incident or a misunderstanding. We're dealing with a systematic pattern of discriminatory behavior that has affected multiple students over several years." He proceeded to detail his findings, the testimonies from other affected families, the review of Mr. Fletcher's personnel file, the documentation of previous complaints that had been inadequately investigated. With each piece of evidence he presented, the expressions on the school officials' faces grew more grave. "Furthermore," John continued, "I've discovered that the school district has been aware of concerns about Mr. Fletcher's classroom management for years, yet failed to take appropriate action to protect students from ongoing harm." Thomas Bradley, the district attorney, leaned forward. "Mr. Dorson, while we appreciate your diligence in gathering this information, I think it's important to note that personnel matters are confidential, and some of the documentation you're referencing may not be admissible in any formal proceedings." David Chin spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd spent decades in courtrooms. "Mr. Bradley, I think you'll find that when civil rights violations are involved, the standards for discovery and admissibility become quite different. And frankly, the fact that this documentation exists at all suggests that the district has been on notice about Mr. Fletcher's problematic behavior for some time." The legal chess match had begun, but John found himself thinking less about courtroom strategy and more about the human cost of the situation. How many students like Rachel had sat in Mr. Fletcher's classroom, gradually losing confidence in themselves and their abilities? How many had simply accepted the treatment as normal, never realizing that they deserved better? Dr. Stevens seemed to be reading his thoughts. "Mr. Dorson," she said, "what would you consider an appropriate resolution to this situation?" John had been preparing for this question since the investigation began. "First," he said, "Mr. Fletcher needs to be removed from the classroom permanently, not transferred, not given the opportunity to resign quietly, but terminated for cause with appropriate documentation in his personnel file. Second, the district needs to implement comprehensive training for all faculty and staff on recognizing and preventing discriminatory behavior. It's clear that the current policies and procedures are inadequate. Third, there needs to be an independent review of the district's handling of previous complaints against Mr. Fletcher, with appropriate remedial action taken regarding any administrators who failed in their duty to protect students. And fourth," he concluded, his voice growing harder, "there needs to be a formal acknowledgement of the harm done to the affected students, with appropriate support provided to help them recover from the psychological damage they've sustained. The room fell silent as the school officials absorbed the magnitude of what John was requesting. These weren't just administrative changes, they were fundamental reforms that would require significant resources and public acknowledgement of serious institutional failures. Thomas Bradley was the first to respond. Mr. Dorson, while we understand your concerns, what you're requesting would require the district to essentially admit liability for alleged civil rights violations. I'm sure you can understand why that would be problematic from a legal standpoint. John felt his temper flare, but David placed a gentle hand on his arm, a reminder to maintain professional composure. Mr. Bradley, John replied, his voice controlled but firm. What I'm requesting is that the district take responsibility for protecting its students from discrimination and harassment. If acknowledging that responsibility creates legal liability, then perhaps that liability is deserved. Dr. Stevens intervened before the conversation could escalate further. Gentlemen, I think we all need some time to consider what's been discussed here today. Mr. Dorson, would you be willing to give us a week to review your findings and develop a comprehensive response? John exchanged a glance with David, who nodded almost imperceptibly. 1 week. John agreed, but I want to be clear that if we can't reach a satisfactory resolution through these discussions, we'll be pursuing other avenues to ensure that justice is served. As they left the meeting, John felt the weight of the week ahead. 7 days to determine whether the school district would do the right thing voluntarily, or whether they would need to force change through the courts. 7 days to decide whether Rachel's courage in speaking up would lead to meaningful reform, or whether the system would once again protect itself at the expense of the students it was meant to serve. The battle lines had been drawn, and now both sides would prepare for whatever came next. The week that followed felt like the longest of John's life. Each day brought new developments, new evidence, and new challenges that tested his resolve as both a lawyer and a father. Rachel, meanwhile, had begun attending MS. Carter's advanced placement history class and was slowly beginning to rediscover her love of learning. But the shadow of Mr. Fletcher's treatment still lingered, manifesting in moments of self-doubt and anxiety that broke John's heart to witness. On Wednesday of that week, John received a call that changed everything. Sandra Martinez, Carmen's mother, had been in touch with other parents in the school district, and word of the investigation had begun to spread through the community's informal networks. The call came from Patricia Washington, whose son Kevin had graduated from Somerton High 2 years earlier. Mr. Dorson, she said, her voice tight with emotion, I heard about what you're doing regarding Mr. Fletcher, and I think you need to know about what happened to Kevin when he was in that man's class. John felt his pulse quicken. Mrs. Washington, I'd be very interested in hearing Kevin's story. Would it be possible for us to meet? That afternoon, John sat in the Washington family's living room, listening to a story that made his blood boil. Kevin, now a college sophomore majoring in education with dreams of becoming a history teacher himself, had been systematically undermined by Mr. Fletcher during his junior year at Somerton High. Kevin used to talk about wanting to teach, Patricia explained, her son sitting beside her on the couch, his jaw set with determination despite the pain of revisiting difficult memories. He'd always been passionate about history, especially African American history, and he thought he could make a difference by becoming an educator. Kevin picked up the story, his voice steady but filled with an anger that had clearly been simmering for years. Mr. Fletcher seemed to take it as a personal challenge when I expressed interest in pursuing education as a career. He'd made comments about how teaching required objective perspective and cultural neutrality, always looking directly at me when he said it. The pattern was depressingly familiar, but Kevin's story had an additional dimension that made it even more troubling. Mr. Fletcher had actively discouraged Kevin from pursuing advanced placement courses, suggesting that he might be more comfortable in standard-level classes. He'd questioned Kevin's college aspirations, implying that he should focus on more realistic career goals. The worst part, Kevin continued, was how he handled my final project. I chose to research the role of African American soldiers in World War II, and I put months of work into it. When I presented it to the class, Mr. Fletcher spent the entire time questioning my sources, suggesting that I was being too focused on race instead of looking at the broader historical context. Patricia's hands clenched into fists as her son spoke. Kevin's grade on that project was a C+, despite the fact that he'd produced college-level research. When we requested a meeting with Mr. Fletcher to discuss the grade, he suggested that Kevin might benefit from learning to see historical events from multiple perspectives, not just his own cultural viewpoint. John felt sick. This wasn't just discrimination, it was a deliberate attempt to crush a young man's educational aspirations and sense of self-worth. Kevin, he said gently, how did this experience affect your plans for college? Kevin's expression grew somber. I almost gave up on the idea of teaching. Mr. Fletcher had convinced me that maybe I wasn't cut out for academic work, that maybe I was too biased to be effective in a classroom. It took my college professors nearly a year to rebuild my confidence in my own abilities. But he did rebuild it, Patricia added with fierce pride. Kevin is on the dean's list now, and he's more determined than ever to become the kind of teacher who supports all of his students. John made detailed notes of Kevin's experience, recognizing how it strengthened the pattern of discrimination he'd already documented. But more than that, he was struck by the young man's resilience and determination to turn his negative experience into positive change for future students. Kevin, he said, would you be willing to provide a formal statement about your experiences in Mr. Fletcher's class? And would you be prepared to testify if this matter proceeds to litigation? Kevin didn't hesitate. Absolutely. If my story can help prevent other students from going through what I experienced, then I want to be part of the solution. That evening, John called David to update him on this latest development. The case was growing stronger by the day, but it was also becoming more complex and emotionally charged. John, David said after hearing about Kevin's experience, we're not just dealing with a single teacher's bias anymore. We're dealing with what appears to be a systematic attempt to discourage students of color from pursuing academic excellence and higher education. This could potentially be a federal civil rights case. John had been thinking the same thing. The pattern of behavior they'd documented went beyond simple workplace discrimination. It represented a violation of students' fundamental right to equal educational opportunities. The next day brought another development that would prove crucial to their case. Diana Chen's parents had decided to come forward with additional information about their daughter's experience. Dr. Ellen Chen called John's office with news that sent chills down his spine. Mr. Dorson, she said, Diana has been keeping a journal of her experiences in Mr. Fletcher's class. When we told her about your investigation, she decided to share it with us. I think you need to see what she's documented. Diana's journal, written in her careful handwriting over the course of several months, provided a day-by-day account of Mr. Fletcher's discriminatory behavior, unlike the other testimonies John had collected, which relied on memory and general impressions. Diana's journal offered specific dates, exact quotes, and detailed descriptions of incidents that painted a devastating picture of systematic harassment. Entry after entry described the subtle ways Mr. Fletcher had made Diana feel unwelcome and intellectually inferior. Comments about her foreign perspective on American history, suggestions that she might not understand certain cultural references that other students would find obvious, questions about whether her family's immigrant background might make it difficult for her to appreciate traditional American values. But it was one particular entry, dated just 3 weeks earlier, that made John's hands shake as he read it. Today, Mr. Fletcher announced that we'd be studying immigration patterns in the early 20th century. When he got to the section about Asian immigration, he looked directly at me and said, Diana, perhaps you could share your family's perspective on this topic. I'm sure our classmates would be interested in hearing about the challenges of adapting to American culture. I wanted to disappear. Everyone was staring at me, and I didn't know what to say. My grandparents came here in the 1960s. Decades after the period we were studying. But Mr. Fletcher acted like I was some kind of museum exhibit instead of just another student trying to learn about history. John set down the journal, his hands trembling with rage. This wasn't just discrimination, it was a calculated campaign to dehumanize students, to reduce them to stereotypes and cultural curiosities rather than treating them as individuals deserving of respect and dignity. When he shared Diana's journal with David, his partner's expression grew increasingly grim. "John," he said finally, "we need to contact the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. This level of systematic discrimination in a public school setting represents a clear violation of federal civil rights laws." John nodded, knowing that involving federal authorities would escalate the case significantly. But looking at the evidence they'd collected, Rachel's testimony, the experiences of Marcus, Diana, and Kevin, the documented pattern of ignored complaints, he realized they had no choice. The school district had been given numerous opportunities to address the problem and had failed. Now it was time for external intervention. That night, as John sat in his study preparing the formal complaint that would be filed with the Office for Civil Rights, he thought about all the students who had suffered in silence over the years. How many had simply endured Mr. Fletcher's treatment without speaking up? How many had changed their academic goals or lost confidence in their abilities because of one teacher's prejudice? But he also thought about Rachel, who was slowly beginning to smile again in her new history class. He thought about Kevin Washington, whose determination to become a teacher had survived Mr. Fletcher's attempts to crush it. He thought about Diana Chin, whose meticulous documentation had provided crucial evidence for their case. These young people had shown remarkable courage in speaking up about their experiences. Now it was John's job to make sure their courage led to meaningful change, not just for them, but for all the students who would come after them. The weight of justice was heavy, but John was ready to carry it. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since this ordeal began, he felt confident that they would win, not just in court, but in the larger fight for educational equality and human dignity. The system had failed these students once. John Dorson was determined to make sure it never failed them again.